In San Francisco, violent earthquakes are a fact of life, from the big one of 1906 to the World Series stopper of 1989.
They've just felt for the moment as if we were going to be thrust right out of the booth.
It's kind of like something that you'd see in a movie, you know? I mean, you don't think that it happened to a family.
Can we solve the mystery of earthquakes before the next big one strikes? From Silicon Valley to San Francisco Bay on the central coast of California, encompassing some of the most desirable real estate on the planet. A warm afternoon in the fall of 1989 is winding down. "75 miles south of San Francisco, at a high school gym in Santa Cruz, a volleyball game is in progress. At the Adams Apple Bar and Grill in Silicon Valley, customers are settling in to watch their two local teams in the World Series.
In Candlestick Park, the Battle of the Bay continues. Game 3 of the 1989 World Series, the Oakland Athletics against the San Francisco Giants. I'm Al Michaels. Welcome to Game 3. It's been dominant Oakland pitching, of course, in the first two games.
At San Francisco's Candlestick Park, 60,000 baseball fans are getting ready for the first pitch. And in a car winding through the heart of Oakland, Mrs. Petra Baruman, her two children, and another Bay Area woman are coming home from the dentist. These widely scattered events were about to become forever linked by a sudden movement deep within the earth.
I'll tell you what, we're having an
People have an earthquake.
A humongous earthquake.
The earth had shaken for a mere 15 seconds, but the effect was devastating and widespread.
It was one of those things where now I know the shaking lasted about 15 seconds. But if you were to have asked me when it stopped shaking, how long did that last? I probably would have said over a minute. Because when that happens, it can't end soon enough.
911 emergency.
Yes, have you gotten word about the Bay Bridge?
What about the Bay Bridge? What's wrong with it?
The upper deck appears to have collapsed during the earthquake.
Jesus Christ, we got to report that they might have on the scene. 911 services emergency. I just heard that something happened to the Bay Bridge. I heard that too, but I can't confirm it. Do you know if there was anything serious? My dad's supposed to be coming at this time. I don't know yet. Okay, I want you to calm down. Okay, all I've heard is that the upper deck collapsed.
Throughout the Central California coast, homes and highways had collapsed. Towns and cities, both inland and along the coast of Monterey Bay, suffered widespread damage. Farther north, at the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula and just across the bay, the shaking caused heavy damage and left residents terrified.
I was in the mezzanine of my 100-year-old Victorian firehouse, and it shook like hell. It went on and on. It was very strong. And this was a building that was built in 1893.
I felt this tremendous jolt. We could see dust coming out of ceilings, and I really thought for a second that this is the big one and it's going to collapse this whole building.
Please keep away from the building.
Many buildings' windows were shattered, particularly large plate glass windows. And I suddenly overheard the sirens, and they were wailing in such a way that they were headed towards the marina.
much of the residential marina district was in shambles. Even hardened firefighters were dumbfounded by the damage.
A woman came up to me and she goes, there's a house down in the street. And I couldn't quite understand what she's talking about. I mean, a house down in the street. I mean, what are you talking about? And so we went on over there, and the house was down in the street. And you walked into the third floor at ground level through the window.
The most urgent concern facing firefighters was not the flattened homes, but rescuing the people trapped inside. But it was in the city of Oakland, just over the shattered span of the Bay Bridge, that the quake had done its worst damage.
We're in the Cypress structure, about 29th Street. It's 10 minutes after 6.
Television crews were beginning to broadcast live pictures from a section of Interstate 880 called the Cypress, a double-deck stretch of the freeway that cuts right through the heart of Oakland.
When I first arrived at the Cypress, it was hard to believe what I was looking at. It was an entire mile and a half worth of elevated freeway structure that had collapsed, pancaked down on the lower section. And this was all elevated probably 60 feet in the air.
"245 tons of concrete had slammed down on the roadbed below, which was just then filling up with rush hour traffic. Gina Lynn was driving home from work.
Next thing I knew, the overpass was falling in front of me, and then I just slammed into it, and then it started falling on top of the car, and I just started kicking the window and just crawled out of the driver's door and got on my hands and knees and crawled to a crack in the freeway.
It's absolutely unbelievable. People scrambling, people running up to the fire engine just in amazement of what had occurred, and please help, there are people trapped.
In the confusion, many volunteers had scaled the broken concrete in a desperate attempt to pull out victims. The other big rescue operation continued in San Francisco's Marina District.
By this time, we're getting the aftershocks going on, and buildings filled with gas, and we heard the building across the street just completely explode.
Ruptured gas lines were now triggering fires in the Marina District.
I thought it was the big one. You have two big apartment buildings down, flames going up. Cypress Freeway, we heard, was collapsed, and I just had no idea how much damage was going out through the whole city.
San Francisco had been battered, as had Oakland and the Santa Cruz area, 75 miles to the south. But there were no collapses in between. The quake had apparently hopscotched from one area to another. Across the bay in Oakland, at the Cypress Freeway collapse, rescue teams worked feverishly to help injured motorists. Nearby, Bay Area resident Pastor Baruman watched the television coverage while he waited for his wife and two children to return home. As images of the Cypress rescue unfolded, he never dreamed that his family was amid the tangled crush of concrete and steel.
We got two bodies down here? And then they start talking about the Cypress. When they said that there was people on the bottom deck, and when they start talking about a little kid that was 6 years old, and it was a little girl that was 9 years old, that's when it hit me. That's when I said, wait a minute, my kids are, 6 and 9. That's when I was worried.
For the Baruman family and many other Bay Area residents, the next few hours would determine who would live would die. Nightfall, October 17, 1989. The San Francisco Bay Area is still reeling from the strongest earthquake in nearly a century. Near downtown Oakland, arc lights illuminate the wreckage of the Cypress Freeway. Dozens are dead. Yet 2 hours after the earthquake, moans from survivors are still being heard. Firefighter Ron Carter was working in a 3-foot cavity in the concrete rubble, trying to access a car with 2 dead women in the front seat and 2 small children trapped beneath them. It was Julio and Kathy Berumen, crushed under the concrete, but still alive. But their mother had died.
We are not going to let these 2 kids die. It didn't matter what, we tried everything. I remember we fired up the saw and there was a shower of sparks that shot underneath this dark cavern, and this was over fumes of gasoline and oil and everything else. So we went to every effort and it was all in whatever it takes, let's get these kids out.
2 hours into the rescue, crews managed to free Kathy Berumen. Watching on live television was her father, who still didn't know that it was his own daughter.
They show when they rescue my daughter, they really show it, you know, when they brought her down on the stretcher, and I was watching that, but I never thought it was her after later.
Kathy Berumen's cheekbone was broken in 8 places, and a shard of skull embedded in her brain. Still, she survived.
I remember somebody talking to me, and it was the guy that rescued us, and he, you know, was asking me my name and, you know, what was going on with me, what I felt. He was just trying to keep me awake and trying to, like, occupy me, you know, just keep me, you know, conscious.
Kathy's brother Julio was still trapped in the car. His right leg was caught beneath the full tonnage of the collapsed freeway. Rescuers feared he would bleed to death. As Oakland firefighters worked to free the boy, their San Francisco counterparts were now fighting a big blaze in the Marina District. Many of the water mains beneath the marina had ruptured, leaving the firefighters without adequate pressure. They relied on fireboats, pumping water out of nearby San Francisco Bay. Crucial help was also being provided by neighborhood residents. Fortunately, there was no wind. The fire was confined to a 1-block area. Before sunrise, it was under control. Oakland, 2 a.m. Little Julio Berumen is still trapped under the Cypress Freeway.
We were able to literally dissect the car, the seats. We had to use extraordinary measures to get the dead occupants out of the front seat. Once we were able to do that, we could clearly see how Julio was pinned inside.
Now, rescue workers faced a grim decision.
And there was no way to get my brother out. So the only way that they could get my brother out of the car was to amputate his right leg there, because otherwise they couldn't get him out of the car.
The space was only about 3.5 feet tall. That was at its highest, and that's where the crossbeam had come down and actually crushed the car in which these people were riding.
I was stuck in there. They couldn't get me out. So they had to, like, amputate, like, my knee. I guess they took my knee apart in order for them to, like, take me out. They had to do that.
We knew he wasn't going to live much longer than he did. He was very cold, his blood pressure was very low, he had lost a lot of blood.
Working inside the tiny crevice, doctors managed to amputate Julio Berumen's leg.
I yelled down that we got him out, and there was a lot of cheering, a lot of camera, media lights, and it was really a good feeling when we got him on the gurney and he was being lowered down. It was like, wow.
For the rescue workers who had saved Julio Berumen's life, it was a moment of triumph. But for the rest of the Bay Area, it was still a night of horror. At the moment, no one knew how many people were dead or injured. As the ashes cooled from the Marina fire on the morning of October 18th, people began to return to what was left of their homes.
People are still in the building. Is what I think. I couldn't save my animals. I couldn't save anybody. I couldn't save any of my belongings. I lost everything.
Residents were given just minutes to collect what they would carry from their ravaged homes. They were the lucky ones.
We know there's some people in there.
How do you know that?
We can see them.
Alive?
No.
For all the damage, scientists had measured the quake at a magnitude of 7.1, a moderate earthquake.
I think the biggest surprise was the degree that there was damage far away from the epicenter. I think there's a popular conception of this earthquake that this was somehow an earthquake that hit San Francisco and Oakland, but in fact they were a long way from where the earthquake occurred. This was really not an urban earthquake or a suburban earthquake, it was a rural earthquake.
The epicenter was under a remote mountain called Loma Prieta in the Santa Cruz Mountains, 65 miles south of San Francisco. The fault ruptured 11 miles underground. As with all earthquakes, its origin lies much deeper. To understand it requires a voyage to the center of the Earth, the hottest part of the planet. All of this heat and energy below gives shape to the layers above, especially the outer layer or crust, which is cracked like an eggshell into 12 pieces called plates. The plates bump and grind against each other due in part to the tremendous heat generated within the Earth. When sections get stuck, pressure builds along the fault lines. Eventually, the plates break free. The result is an earthquake.
The plates are moving past each other. They're pushing against each other. When the stress builds up to a critical point, they snap, and the snapping of the plates basically produces the seismic waves. That's the earthquake.
The San Andreas Fault, which runs nearly the length of California, is only one of many faults crisscrossing the state. It was in the Santa Cruz Mountains that an offshoot of the San Andreas erupted in 1989.
These faults, typically at their base, let's say 10 miles down, are moving at a few inches a year. And when that earthquake occurs, when that rupture begins, that fault, that motion is going to accelerate from a few inches a year to about 5,000 miles an hour. And it's going to do that in 3 seconds. So this rupture of the fault is a catastrophic process, unlike hardly anything else in nature.
The Loma Prieta shockwaves rattled the epicenter area. A cross-section view reveals how they also penetrated deep into the earth and ricocheted upward.
Bounced back up and came up in the vicinity of Oakland and San Francisco. Kind of an amazing phenomena, just a bounce like a light wave bouncing off a mirror. And those distant waves managed to do a great deal of damage in the most vulnerable parts of structures in Oakland and the marina.
Much of the Bay Area sits atop soft and sandy soils like this that shake more during an earthquake. This is probably the worst kind of soil to support a city.
As early as the mid-1970s, we began producing detailed maps that showed areas where ground shaking was going to be enhanced as a consequence of the poor ground conditions. And these maps proved to be very good predictors of the localization of damage.
Much of the Marina District was largely built on land reclaimed from the bay. Parts of this neighborhood turned into quicksand during the earthquake, due to a phenomenon called liquefaction. Structures sitting atop sandy and muddy soils shake more during an earthquake than those built on bedrock. The shaking causes the water, which lies only 10 feet below, to flow up. The ground is no longer stable. The exclusive Marina District was built on the worst kind of soil. In the days after the quake, then President Bush got a first-hand look at the Cypress Freeway collapse.
These big cross sections?
No,
they just crumbled too.
Just went straight down. A lot of the people who were killed by these giant cross beams.
Yeah.
Hit their cars.
He also paid a visit to Julio Berumen, who was in the hospital after having his leg amputated.
I guess the most emotional thing was talking first to the doctors and then to the father of the little boy whose life was saved on the freeway, crushed freeway. So there's this human dimension that's brought home much more clearly by coming here.
As the Bay Area celebrated its small miracles of survival, it also counted its losses. 62 people had died. 42 of those in the collapse of the Cypress Freeway. The quake had also cost $6 billion in damaged property. Yet all told, the Bay Area may have gotten off cheaply.
In no sense was this a great earthquake for the Bay Area or any other place in the world. For example, historically, the 1906 earthquake was something like 20 times larger. So this was a garden variety earthquake, not some Armageddon.
The big one still lurks in the serpentine maze of faults underlying the Bay Area, leading many to wonder why this metropolis was ever built on such treacherous ground. The secret isn't just scientific. It involves a conspiracy buried deep within San Francisco's past. Within the graceful contours of San Francisco's hills lie geologic secrets and a history of suppression of vital earthquake data. The Bay Area's first recorded earthquake came in 1868, when much of the region was farmland. It is now largely forgotten, but at the time it was known as the Great San Francisco Earthquake. The shock, estimated at magnitude 7.0, came from beneath the rural town of Hayward, on a fault line running along the eastern shore of the bay. The earth ruptured for 30 miles, leaving the workers at the local courthouse with a beautiful yet breezy view. San Francisco, a short train ride away, also suffered heavy damage. The earthquake so alarmed the city's business leaders that they commissioned a report to gauge the ongoing seismic threat. A team of local scientists went to work.
And they discovered that there was a rupture at the ground and that it moved the fault several feet. And they further discovered that the Hayward Fault extended to the north and south, and that San Andreas was on the other side. And they said, look, this is in the city's future, not just in its past. They submitted their report, and this businessman got the report, and he was horrified to see that this might hurt San Francisco's business opportunities, so he destroyed it.
Unaware of the threat of earthquakes, thousands continued flocking to the city. San Francisco grew, building on and around its fault lines. Then came a fateful day in April of 1906.
When I felt the earthquake, I was in bed in Oakland, and I heard our chimney come down and the plates and they were on the room crashing. and my mother in the next room crying out, "This is the end of the world."
Having survived the shaking in Oakland, 6-year-old Marion Cowan crossed the bay with his mother to San Francisco. He marveled at the sight of the stricken city. The earth had shaken for a minute and a half. It was an enormous jolt of magnitude 7.8, as much as 33 times more powerful than the 1989 Loma Prieta shock.
This is a huge rupture. Trains that were sitting on their tracks were thrown over on their side. Huge ground displacements. Permanently moved the North American side of the Bay Area south and permanently moved the Pacific side north by 10 or 15 feet.
The earthquake brought with it another disaster, fire. Stoves and furnaces rattled by the shock ignited many of the city's wooden buildings, creating a raging inferno. Water mains had broken. It appeared nothing could stop the flames. 2/3 of the city had burned. Chinatown, Market Street, Telegraph Hill. At the time, the U.S. Army reported 498 people dead, an attempt by authorities to minimize the effects of the quake. The current estimate is that 3,000 people died. It was the worst natural disaster in the nation's history. By now, it was obvious that the earthquake faults posed a serious threat to San Francisco. But still, civic leaders stonewalled the public. Powerful interests called it the Great San Francisco Fire, minimizing the role of the earthquake to maximize the city's development.
The people who were suppressing the information about what happened in previous quakes generally tend to be the real estate interests in San Francisco, because the major fortunes had been made and still are made in downtown and peripheral real estate in San Francisco, and I think that they have very little interest in people knowing what could happen after the next earthquake in those areas.
And they succeeded. By 1915, San Francisco was almost fully rebuilt, featuring a new city hall, replacing the old one that was destroyed in 1906. The city was host to the Pan-Pacific Exposition, a World's Fair celebrating both the city's rebirth and the opening of the Panama Canal. Among the visiting celebrities, film star Fatty Arbuckle, one of Hollywood's top comedians. The world came to San Francisco to celebrate the city's renaissance, thinking that earthquakes were a thing of the past. The exposition grounds had been created by landfill dredged from the bay. Once the exposition was over, the buildings were demolished, and on the very same landfill was built the Marina District. It's still vulnerable, expensive, and the worst possible ground for buildings. Earthquakes will return here. They follow their own timetable. Yet San Franciscans are resilient risk takers, betting that it won't happen to them. But there are clues emanating from the earth that may indicate when the next big one will strike. Can scientists decipher the warnings before it's too late?
I love San Francisco. It's the best city in America. Why would I leave?
Moving? No. Certainly not.
I've never experienced an earthquake before, so it's one of those I don't feel like it can happen to me.
It could be a lot worse. I mean, if you only have to worry about it once every 10 or 15 years, I don't think it's going to be anything to really deal with. At least I hope not.
San Franciscans' attitude is neither unique nor surprising. Shaky ground is common in plenty of other cities: Los Angeles, Seattle, Memphis, and especially across the Pacific, Tokyo. Tokyo is a geological cousin of San Francisco. They both sit atop a maze of earthquake faults and share a troubled seismic past. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 was a magnitude 8.4 and struck just outside Tokyo. The quake was also followed by a huge firestorm, just like in San Francisco. But the destruction here was on a far greater scale. 140,000 people died. Thousands huddled in the river to escape the raging fire. Many of them didn't survive. The horror of the earthquake wasn't enough to deter the people of Tokyo, as it hadn't stopped San Franciscans from rebuilding on the same shaky ground. San Francisco, following the 1906 disaster, seemed to ignore what happened in Tokyo and emphasized construction over caution. To accommodate the growing population, the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges were built. The area was enjoying a rare period free from earthquakes, what scientists now call the seismic shadow of the great 1906 earthquake.
The effect of the 1906 earthquake seemed to be to shut everything down in the Bay Area. That is, all these various faults that run through the Bay Area did not have any earthquakes on it. It's been a remarkably quiet, calm place.
It was a kind of a fantasy period, really, in which people in California tended to think that that was all history. Those great earthquakes were history, when in fact, of course, they weren't. It was just a period of, an unusual period of seismic quiescence. It's during that time that both Northern and Southern California, the metropolitan regions, really exploded.
During the 1980s, the region saw the meteoric rise of the high-tech industry in an area known as Silicon Valley, just south of San Francisco. This second gold rush brought tens of thousands from all over the world, attracted by the opportunity and the area's scenic beauty.
The meeting of the water and the land is among the most spectacular in the world. And this landscape has literally been carved by the San Andreas Fault and the other branches of the plate boundary system.
Earthquakes created this natural beauty over millions of years. The 1989 Bay Area quake was just one of them. But this shock may have also marked the end of the so-called seismic shadow, the quiet period between earthquakes in the Bay Area.
What we are now seeing is that the stress is rebuilding on those other faults in the Bay Area, so we anticipate that they'll return to produce the same kind of earthquakes that we're seeing between the time of the gold rush and the 1906 earthquake.
This could mean the Bay Area will see a series of moderate earthquakes similar to the one in 1989 sooner rather than later. But why can't scientists predict quakes with more precision?
Basically, the problem is many earthquake prediction experiments have been run, data have been collected that seem very promising. However, they're not repeatable, or half the observations show some signal prior to an earthquake, the other half don't. So at this point, we can have a theory about how earthquakes occur in a regular pattern, but the reality is there's always surprises with the Earth.
There are 4 major earthquake faults snaking through the San Francisco Bay Area, each operating on its own geologic timetable. Scientists are trying to find out which one is most likely to have an earthquake. Global positioning satellites, known as GPS, are helping. Several small antennas on opposite sides of a fault are installed to receive signals from satellites. As the plates glide past each other, the satellites track even the slightest shift along the fault line. Underneath this lake, just south of San Francisco, lies the San Andreas Fault. It's where the gigantic North American and Pacific plates meet. Here, each side of the lake sits on a different plate, which are moving past each other 2 inches per year.
What GPS observations are telling us is that some parts of both the San Andreas and Hayward Fault creep. They just move along steadily every day, and they're not going to produce large earthquakes. Other parts of the faults in the Bay Area are stuck.
Where the fault is moving, there is less likelihood of an earthquake. But in the stuck sections, stress may be building up that is more likely to be relieved by an earthquake. GPS can help identify these stress points and indicate which sections of the 4 major faults are likely to snap. Under these placid hills, an hour's drive north of San Francisco, could lie clues about when the next big earthquake will strike. The scenic beauty here belies the geologic time bomb ticking below and has scientists digging for data. This is the Rogers Creek Fault, one of the 4 seismic hotspots bracketing the Bay Area. Here, scientists are cutting a trench across the fault to look for traces of past earthquakes. Geologist David Schwartz hopes an historical profile will gradually emerge, revealing a timetable of earthquakes.
When a fault breaks, the rupture starts at about 6 or 7 miles below the surface, and it's basically a crack, and the crack comes all the way up to the surface. It deforms the surface, it leaves a signature, and then it's buried and it's preserved. It's like a fossil. So we try to come to places like this where we think there's evidence of these past or fossil earthquakes, and basically open a trench like this, and it's sort of like reading a book. Right away, what you can see is this major change in color along this vertical line extending from the bottom of the trench and goes along to here, and then we sort of lose it at about this point. This is the fault. This is the main trace of the Rogers Creek Fault. This is the tip of the crack that started at 6 miles below the surface during the last large earthquake and broke all the way up to the surface.
During an earthquake, the ground moves upward. Over time, this displacement of the land is buried, covered by layers of sediment. A cross-section view of the fault reveals how earthquakes shift the layers. Each subsequent quake moves the layers even more. The layers can be dated to see how often earthquakes occur.
One of the things we're really trying to do is to work out the pattern of past earthquake activity on all of the large faults in the Bay Area. The more we know the pattern of past activity, the more precisely we can say something about the future.
Even with this data, scientists still can't predict precisely when an earthquake will occur, but they can forecast an approximate time frame. They believe that during the next 30 years, there's at least a 2 out of 3 chance that another major quake will rock the Bay Area. The epicenter may not be so far away. It could be a direct hit. How will one of the nation's most densely populated regions fare? Every minute of every day, the seismic pressure is building along the Bay Area's fault lines.
As we look around the U.S. and say, where are the places that were vulnerable to earthquakes? High on everyone's list is the Hayward Fault in the eastern San Francisco Bay region. And the reason for this is it's a relatively fast-moving fault, moving almost a centimeter a year, and it's a fault that's heavily urbanized. We've got several million people that live either directly on the fault trace or within just a few miles of it.
It was here in Hayward in 1868 that the fault last snapped. It throws a scare into seismologists, not only because of its history, but because it underlies much of the urban area along the eastern edge of San Francisco Bay.
If we were to have an earthquake on the northern Hayward Fault, the entire Bay Area would be disrupted. The major commuting corridors cross the Hayward Fault. Our main water supply that comes from the Sierra Nevada, the Hetch Hetchy Aqueduct, crosses the Hayward Fault. The fault runs right through fire stations, hospitals, all the major freeways. It would be a disaster.
January 17, 1995, Kobe, Japan. The sixth largest port in the world was rocked by a 7.1 earthquake. It was a warning. Kobe's geology is very similar to the Bay Area. Kobe's soft soils also intensified the damage and engineered the collapse of the city's major freeway. Thousands died. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. It was a far greater disaster than the 1989 Loma Prieta quake that ravaged the San Francisco Bay Area.
Kobe gave us the wake-up call that Loma Prieta denied us. Kobe is an example of a moderate-sized earthquake, actually smaller than Loma Prieta and only a smidge larger than the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles that caused 6,000 loss of lives and about $100 billion of damage.
Kobe is a vivid example of what the Bay Area might be in for. There could be major damage to highways and bridges, even well-built structures. According to government earthquake experts, most of the homes in Berkeley that are not retrofitted will be lost to the quake. Especially vulnerable are the older buildings of the University of California at Berkeley. The fault line runs right under the football stadium, leaving a signature crack in the facade. The seismic pressure is gradually splitting the stadium apart. In 15 seconds, a major earthquake could devastate the picture postcard campus. Estimates for retrofitting the campus run up to $1 billion. The work is proceeding. But will engineers beat the geologic clock? A quake along the Hayward Fault will also rattle nearby San Francisco.
I see a repeat in many ways of 1906. You'll probably have a major earthquake and then you'll begin having a fire. San Francisco is in a particularly vulnerable position because many of the firemen who work in San Francisco can't afford to live here. They live across the bridges, and those will probably be out of order when the earthquake happens.
What would happen if the big one comes in the daytime, when bridges and roads are filled with traffic, and high-rises are packed with people. The Department of the Interior estimates as many as 4,500 could be killed and over 100,000 injured. Of particular concern is the span between San Francisco and Oakland. It still needs repair. Engineers have determined that the Bay Bridge needs an entirely new eastern half, from approximately the middle of the bay to Oakland. The bridge is anchored in mud, which will amplify the effects of an earthquake. Like a huge inverted pendulum, the upper part of the bridge will shake more strongly than the lower part, causing the deck to collapse.
We're not ready for a Hayward earthquake, nor will we be ever. It's incredibly difficult to fully prepare for a rare eventuality. But there are some crying needs which are clear. Right now, the most traveled bridge in the nation, the Bay Bridge, will not survive an earthquake.
10 years after the 1989 earthquake, the Bay Bridge still had not been retrofitted to withstand another big shock.
The reason that it's taken so long is first they had to do a number of seismic studies of it, of the structure and of the geological structure that it's based on, and then they had to do the design for it, and then they had to raise the money for it, and then they had to approve the design for it, and so all of this takes time. Meanwhile, they've been retrofitting all of the freeways around the Bay Area, but the vital link itself, the Bay Bridge, remains in a very, very dangerous condition.
The Bay Bridge stands as a symbol of San Francisco's vulnerability to the forces of nature. But some lessons from the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake have been heeded. Today, the Bay Area is better prepared than ever for the next big earthquake.
So we need to be ready. Citizens need to be prepared. We are doing that from our Office of Emergency Services. There's a program that organizes blocks of neighbors. We'll be giving instructions. We have, but we have to do more in terms of storing food, knowing and having water, and then knowing how to turn off your gas, and be prepared to be on your own for 72 hours.
Many of the area's older structures, such as the classic San Francisco Victorians, are also being strengthened to current seismic standards. Commercial buildings have been retrofitted with a heavy lattice of steel beams. So have some government structures. Two of the most visible examples of retrofitting are San Francisco. Both sustained major damage during the 1989 quake. In the basement of Oakland City Hall, concrete and steel trusses were installed to widen the base of this narrow building. They stabilized the structure like training wheels on a bicycle. Both buildings were raised while base isolators were installed underneath to cushion seismic shocks. Inside the black casing is a layer cake of 40 strips of rubber and steel, designed to absorb the seismic shock and dampen the impact of an earthquake. These improvements should enable the buildings to roll, not rock, during the next big quake. To prevent another freeway collapse, many Bay Area roads have been reinforced. The Cypress Freeway, however, was damaged beyond repair. Residents did not want it rebuilt. Today, only a long strip of parkway marks the spot where so many lost their lives. For Julio Berumen and his sister Kathy, who survived the collapse of the Cypress, that fateful day in 1989 was both tragic and miraculous.
I feel very lucky to be alive. I mean, my brother and myself had our guardian angels with us, and to this day we still do. I just feel privileged to be alive, and I feel like I, in a way, have a second chance.
As bad as it was, and as disastrous as it was, And of course, it's of no solace to people who lost family members or relatives, but I think we came that close to the greatest natural disaster in the history of this country.
The San Francisco Bay Area is a giant seismic laboratory. And with each successive earthquake, scientists and residents are learning how to survive, rebuild, and better prepare for the next one.
If we have this knowledge, if we know what the risks are from the faults, and if we know what the risks are from our buildings, we can make some good rational choices, and the process will follow. Given a little bit of time, ingenuity, and a little bit of money, we can make this a safe place.
As the geological clock ticks on, the odds of yet another quake increase. Some are betting that an earthquake won't happen in their lifetime. They are likely to lose. Others are putting their money on preparation, being ready for the big one. It's the safest bet, and the one that's most likely to pay off.